just for a sec.
Okay, good.
Good morning, everyone.
Okay.
Welcome to our Athletes Soul webinar this morning. We are joined with Erika and Sammy Diffendaffer, and they are two of our transition coaches for Athletes Soul. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the process of grieving and transitioning out of sport. I'll go back to this topic in a minute. First of all, I wanted to let you know that we are recording the webinar and you will be able to find it on our website. I will be also sharing the link after the event. If you would like to ask some question, you can do so by clicking on the Q&A box or the chat box and ask your question throughout the event. Today is going to be a little bit different than what you're used to for our webinar. Basically, we're going to go back and forth with questions with both Erika and Sammy, and talking into this process of grieving, as well as other element of the transition to life after sport. So before I start, I want to introduce you to both Erika and Sammy and tell you a little bit more about their journey and where they're coming from. So I'm going to be starting with Erika. Erika is a certified life mastery consultant. She's also a licensed psychotherapist and success coach. She has 20 years experience working with professional and amateur athletes, as well as entrepreneur and business professional around the world. She's passionate about helping athletes create their ideal result inside and outside of sport, for more freedom, fulfillment, and prosperity. She played water polo at Purdue University and is now an avid endurance athlete. Welcome, Erika. I think you are frozen. Can you hear us?
Am I? It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Miriam. Hopefully I'm not frozen. I know something's been kind of going on with my Zoom meetings lately. I don't know if it's my internet or what, but.
Well, we can hear you just fine. So I'm going to introduce Sammy, and then we're going to go on with our discussion. So Sammy is a licensed marriage and family therapist with her own practice in Dallas. She's passionate about helping individuals learn the power of assertiveness, boundaries, and social correctness, as well as healthy relationship. She's a former collegiate softball player and was a 4-year letter winner at Oklahoma State University. Welcome, Sammy.
Thanks.
And obviously,
Marianne.
the two of them are one of our transition coaches for Athletes Soul. So they're very well read, obviously, in the transition process because they've been there themselves as collegiate athlete, but also they've worked with athletes and have been going through our transition coaching program. So today we wanted to, since the two of you are both licensed therapists, we wanted to focus a little bit more on the emotional and social challenges that athletes may be facing when they transition out of sport. And so I guess I wanted to start maybe with a question to Erika. What elements do you see influence athletes during their transition when they're moving to life outside of sport?
Well, there's a number of different things. Clearly, with COVID kind of descending upon us over the last few months, there's been a lot of abrupt and unplanned transitions. So I think kind of how the retirement occurs is a big piece of all of this. Or even, you know, if it's not retirement, even if it's pressing pause, that's still kind of a transition out of the normal routine and competition and all of those things as well. So a big factor, I think, in how the athlete experiences the retirement or the transition is whether or not it's planned or unplanned. So I think, you know, any athlete who's had an injury can also relate to having a shift in the schedule and kind of having to readjust expectations and routine and, you know, nutrition, workouts, all of that kind of stuff. So how the transition occurs is a big piece, I think, in terms of the influence in how they're experiencing it. Closure is another piece, I think, that, if you had been planning, like say it's your senior year, and you knew that this was going to be your final year of competition. In my case, it was, because I played water polo and I knew that I wasn't going to be going any further than that post-college. So kind of being able to decide, how I wanted to experience the end of my season and that kind of thing, allowed for me to gain closure. So, with the abrupt cancellations or postponement of events, then we're into a whole other scenario where closure maybe doesn't feel like it's been achieved. And so kind of gaining some closure, and there are ways to kind of bring about your own closure, but that's kind of another question. So how the retirement occurred is the first thing. The second thing is really what I've seen is how deeply how deeply an athlete really relates to the sport in terms of their identity. So, it can be easy, I have seen, for athletes to kind of define themselves by being an athlete. And so if that's, the full kind of spectrum of how they see themselves, that can be another challenge if the sport is suddenly not available. So really, full spectrum identity has been a focus of like the athlete development specialists, and I think that that's been a really important piece. And then also, there's the basic needs. If someone's transitioning out of professional sport for whatever reason, there could be a shift in finances, the habits around money. In addition to finances, like nutrition, their support structure, their routine, going from something that's really regimented to maybe something where there's little to no structure. That's external, kind of having to create that structure on their own. And then also just the camaraderie of like having a team, and potentially, disconnecting from that. I know with COVID, that's been something where, I've seen athletes connecting, virtually, which has been great, but it's also, it's a shift from what they've been experiencing, especially if you've been practicing with your team every single day, multiple times a day. So those are kind of the main components that I've seen in terms of how transition can really impact an athlete, or some of the components of the impact of transition.
Yeah, and I think that was very clear. You obviously highlighted three things: the event of the retirement and how that came about, how the athlete is closely associated with his athletic identity, and then thirdly, sort of all of the environmental as well as basic needs type of elements, whether it's finance or physiological or social and structural. So I thought that was very clear. And I guess I'm gonna turn to Sammy for a related question to this is what emotional challenges or struggle can be identified or can come along with the transition from sports. So Erika talked a little bit about the event of retirement and all these elements, but from an emotional perspective, what could we observe?
I like that you're bringing emotion up, Miriam, because I think emotion, all encompassing, sometimes, especially maybe as an athlete or as a male, even, we have these stereotypes to say, oh, emotion is weak. But that's really not the case. There is an entire emotional experience that we face as human beings, whether we want to address it and look at it or not. So when it comes to the retirement itself, physical activity alone boosts a hormone in our brain that that is considered like a happy drug. And so I think that's one thing that logistically, even unless that athlete is planning to keep up a similar exercise regimen, they are going to have some biological changes that impact their emotion and their mood. When it comes to the loss of the sport itself, as you know, something like Erika talked about, something that is your identity, it is who you are, and it's everything that you're used to. That alone kind of shakes us up a little bit on the inside. Not only are our routines different, but how we feel about ourselves, our level of confidence, just, you know, that boost that we maybe get, like Erika talks about seeing people that we know and trust in person every day, working towards a shared goal. When all of that just in an instant goes away, a person is absolutely going to have a great deal to sift through and emotionally just kind of wrestle with, essentially. I think sometimes it is an unknown. You as an athlete kind of know you're going to retire, but unless you've taken adequate steps and just in your brain really recognize what that means to retire, I think you're going to perhaps be kind of turned upside down before you realize it. And that's when things get really tricky, is when you don't expect to feel all this, yet you do, and you're not quite sure what to do with it.
I really like that you touch on the biological changes that can impact mood and emotion, because I think often it's not acknowledged, and a lot of people don't even know about it. And I think for a lot of athletes, this is really surprising, and they will suddenly feel not themselves, I guess is a way to put it, or feel very different or feel down, and they're not used to it because they're usually bubbly or very dynamic. And I can see that this would be quite a surprise. So I really like that you started with that, because I think it's perhaps not as well known in that transition process as other element of you know, emotional changes and things that go with it. We definitely can recognize the physical changes and the change in routine, and we've heard a lot about the identity, but I think just the hormonal changes that come with transitioning are pretty impactful. So I wanted to touch a little bit on the concept of ambiguous loss, as well as the process of grieving. Erika mentioned it a little bit, especially with the event that have been happening with COVID and the cancellation of sporting event, the end of senior year for a lot of senior athletes who have been missing on their championship. There's been a lot of athletes and student athletes impacted by all of this. Some of whom would probably have been pushed into retirement abruptly without choosing it, and you know, didn't have a full season. Some of them perhaps still considering their options and not knowing what they're gonna do, whether they're gonna, you know, take that 5th year of eligibility and go back to finish that season they haven't had, or whether they have one more year to go to the Olympics, or whether they have no idea when their sporting season is going to resume. And that's the case for a lot of the professional athletes as well. So Sammy, can you explain for us first of all, the process of grieving, and how does that apply to athletes specifically and grieving their sport?
Sure. Grieving, originally we kind of thought that a person would go through really specific steps with grief. There's the initial experience where you're in denial, you're in shock. It's almost not real feeling. That can be followed with anger, and kind of bargaining to maybe wrestle and bargain with God to bring your loved one back, or just finding a way, trying to find a way to bring whatever it is back that you have lost. There's obviously sadness and depression, and then ultimately the point at which, you know, we consider grief to be resolved is the point at which we can accept what has happened, and maybe we can talk about it in a way where our perspective has shifted, that yes, this did happen, this was something difficult that I experienced or went through, or something that I lost, but I am okay. That process, though, as I mentioned, you know, they have these kind of phases or steps that they talk about, and they do list them in specific order. But just because a person kind of navigates to this place where, okay, I've lost my sport, and I'm no longer angry about it, I am kind of sad, it doesn't mean that they may not even go back and in a week feel again angry all over that COVID-19 stole my senior season, or that you know, I was kind of at the end of my career as an Olympic athlete, and it was my last chance to go out with a bang, and now I don't know if I can maintain that with my age, or whatever it may be. So absolutely, grief is something that these athletes are going to experience, and every single person is going to experience it in a different way. There is no set way that we grieve, but you know, it's absolutely worth talking about as far as the COVID issue, and in addition, the issue of saying goodbye to your sport, even if it comes in a natural way, is something that often brings upon what we know to be grief. It's as if we've lost a person close to us.
And it's interesting what you've mentioned, because you're talking about a linear process of grieving as the original model, which I think a lot of people are very they're very aware of. I guess is probably the most common model that is known, but it's not that simple, and it's often not experienced so linearly, I guess, than the original model. And I think that's what you touched on, and that was really interesting. Erika, could you tell us, because we talked a little bit about the process of grieving. There's also, I mentioned at the beginning, the ambiguous loss, and I wanted you to touch base on unanticipated loss, when the end of your career comes abruptly, and you were not planning for it. Can you talk about this a little bit, and also let us know what the potential impacts could be of that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I love that Sammy highlighted how the stages of grief are, they can kind of be intermingled, and you can kind of bounce around between all of them. So obviously, if this is unplanned, if an end of a season is unplanned, if you're a senior or an Olympic athlete, regardless of what level of sport, it is absolutely normal to experience grief. And so that could look like anger. Anger is probably the easiest to kind of be in, because it's bristly and it kind of protects, so to speak, protects you. You don't have to be with the softer emotions like the sadness, or really like coming to really take a look at what you lost and feel how it feels to experience that. So, you know, if we're talking about kind of an unresolved or unanticipated, like end of a season, you know, there's obviously a lack of closure with that. There can be a sense of a lack of closure. Perhaps like Sammy referred to, you had some personal goals that you were ready to accomplish, or some team goals even. And those are suddenly kind of just gone. And also, I think I mentioned this before, but the team culture and the camaraderie and, the consistency in kind of working towards a common goal, having that kind of be absent, that in and of itself can bring about some loss and some grief too. So I think it's really important that the athlete, and even any support people who are working with the athletes, this could be their parents, their spouses, their athlete specialists, coaches, just making sure that the athlete has an ability to kind of identify, like, hey, this was here before and now it's gone. And just being able to like verbalize that and just have that recognition, like, this is a shift. For some people, it might be more of a challenge than others in terms of what they're experiencing from an emotional level. But just knowing that if you are experiencing sadness or depression or loss or denial, or any of the stages of grief, it's kind of like, just because that's happening, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong with you or that you're going to get stuck there forever. This is something too, I always think about when I think about like mental health diagnoses. If we were to read through different mental health diagnoses, the symptoms maybe at one time or another we've experienced, but it's not necessarily the fact that that is there. It's more like the duration and the severity. So I would say with, the unanticipated end of a season, just being aware, like, hey, I am experiencing feelings about this, and then having that be okay. So, having that like permission within inside yourself as an athlete to just allow for the feelings to exist. And also knowing, like, hey, you don't have to set up camp there. You don't need to align with these feelings for the rest of your life. But like, my mentor always says, have a pity party, but like any other party, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I love that because, you can't do a spiritual bypass on these feelings. You can't just say, hey, I'm not going to feel this. If you are experiencing it, for some athletes, maybe it's not as much of a awareness of a change. But I think for many athletes, it really is pretty significant in terms of how they're feeling. So I would just, say that really taking an inventory on how you're feeling, allowing those feelings to exist, knowing that it's completely normal, especially, I think now more than ever in our COVID situation, you can look around and see so many athletes are in the exact same boat with not knowing what's next and having things have come to an abrupt end. So I feel like I'm kind of rambling here, but I would just invite the athlete to be able to acknowledge however it is that they're feeling, know that it's completely normal. If you're pissed, yep, there's a lot of disappointment involved and things coming to an end abruptly and not having any sense of a closure. Or if you're sad, or, if you're still kind of in that bargaining phase, well, maybe there's a way I can get back to this, or, perhaps there is. Just knowing like you can kind of move in and out of that and giving yourself permission to do that. And then for your support system, or those of you who are supporting athletes, to just allow for, the athlete to be able to be open about how it is that they're feeling, be able to identify what it is that they're feeling. And, teammates can commiserate, friends, like just kind of giving each other some bandwidth for the emotional experience, without trying to be like, okay, well, it's over, so move on. because maybe it looks that way from the outside, but it's not that simple if you look at the emotional impact.
Yeah. And I really like that you're outlining this as a process, really, where you have to go through the spectrum of all these emotions and allowing yourself not to get stuck just with the anger, because perhaps as an athlete, this is what you feel most comfortable with. In allowing yourself to go deeper into that process, and in some of the more vulnerable type of emotions that you will be feeling and that are totally normal, and allowing you to do that and knowing that it's temporary, and there's no shame in going through that process at all. I thought that was
well, and that's the thing too, because it's a choice. Like, you can choose to be pissed off and say your life is ruined because this happened. I mean, or you can say, you know what, I'm going to allow myself to feel how it feels for a while, and maybe like I'll give myself 6 months. And if I'm still feeling, really upset about this, or my life is turned upside down, then I'm going to seek out some additional support, because I know that maybe I'm not, bouncing back the way I would like to bounce back or whatever. But like you said, temporary, I think, is the key, because no one wants to get kind of stuck in some resentment or anger about things being taken away. And that's a choice. You can choose to be resentful, or you can choose to grow. And I think, we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah. And can you, I guess that's a question for you, Sammy. Can you tell us a little bit, what could be the long-term consequences for athletes of not dealing with their grieving process, or being stuck in it?
Yeah, I think when we get kind of stuck there, that one is sneaky, because like you say, and we always want to leave space for the possibility for an athlete to not be experiencing extremely deep or life-altering emotions about having lost their sport. However, I am venturing to say, in my experience in this field, it's going to be very difficult for anyone to have had something a part of their life for 20 plus years and it not have an impact. So just be aware of that. I think as athletes as well, part of what makes us good at being an athlete is that we can kind of stuff stuff down, the pain specifically. So when we're training, when we're working out, in order to take ourselves to the next level, to some degree, we have to be able to push down negative feelings like, oh, this hurts, this burns, I can't go any further. We have to say no to those feelings. So we get good, essentially, at denying some of our feelings. And so when it comes to not emotionally processing something as big as saying goodbye to your sport, or feeling maybe your sport was kind of ripped away from you unexpectedly, just like this year, that's where athletes, I think, are going to notice it comes up later. So even if we're able to suppress it for a while, there's going to be a point at which that thing says, I'm not staying down here any longer. It's going to come out. And it may come out in little ways that maybe you avoid watching your sport for a while. Maybe you don't realize it, but you don't, if you're faced with having children who want to, start to get involved with the sport, that stuff is going to creep back up, and it's going to need to be dealt with. So really, the long-term detriments are just that you're kind of delaying the inevitable, and you're probably not allowing yourself to be as efficient of a human being when you're constantly trying to keep the lid on something that wants to boil out.
That's really interesting that you're finishing with this, because I really like the link to sort of high performance as a person. I think this is something that athletes can really resonate with. And if you put it in those terms, perhaps it's much easier to allow yourself as an athlete to go through that process of grieving, knowing that you can perform better in your next career because you've allowed yourself to do that. I think, we generally know that athletes don't really like to seek help. And so I think mentioning that is really interesting, and perhaps a point that could help a lot of athletes coming to terms with the fact that it's okay to speak to someone about it and to get some support through that process. How can an athlete recognize that perhaps they're not dealing with their grieving process as efficiently or efficaciously as they were thinking? What can they do about it? What is a period of time where maybe it's time to say, I'm not dealing with this the right way, and I need some support, and how proactive can they be about it? What do you think, Erika?
So, I loved what Sammy said about the high performance as well. That was awesome. And so when we're talking about like what you can do as an athlete, I can't remember where I read this, but someone was talking about feelings, and they were like, feelings are like worms. They're eventually going to come to the surface. You can bury a stick, you can bury a bucket, but you can't bury a worm. Well, you can, but it'll squirm its way out eventually. So what, in my experience, feelings kind of get expressed within the body if they're not expressed overtly. Sorry, my son is screaming in the background. I hope you can't. A lot of times, and I don't know if you've had any experience with yoga, and maybe, different athletes have a really good understanding of this in terms of like your body wisdom. If you kind of stuff things or, try to push the feelings down, it can be, you might notice that there's tightness in a certain area, or you might even have an injury, or you may experience an illness. So I think it's important to just have an awareness of that, because it isn't a weakness to actually be able to talk about this stuff and process through it. And so when we're looking at like support, making it okay. And like, in my ideal vision for how this would all work with athletes is just having a culture where people can express this and express their experience and their feelings about whatever is going on in terms of their emotional experience of transition. And then having, a culture in which that is okay. Like obviously working or performing at a high level and being able to push down pain and things like that can serve you in your sport while you're active in it in certain instances. But then just knowing, like, just like anything, too much of a good thing, it eventually can get to a point where it doesn't serve. So I think as for the athlete, kind of discerning, okay, so is this helping me, how I'm feeling right now and how I'm dealing with it? That's an important piece. But then also as athlete, support system, parents, whoever that might be, spouses, coaches, allowing for some dialogue and communication around how this is all being experienced, by different, and having like one experience or one person's experience doesn't need to define everybody else's, but just allowing for the fact that everyone's going to have their different experiences and allowing space for them to have the different experiences. So I would just, I would say that having the door open for those discussions, and even the athlete themselves allowing for the door open in their own mind to experience the feelings, maybe even reminisce or experience some memories, and a way to kind of re-engage with the sport, whether it's in your mind or you know, Sammy mentioned not wanting to watch it, you know, so that would just be something to get curious about. You know, I think bringing curiosity to your emotional experience is a really important piece of all of this, especially when we're talking about, you know, transforming one experience or emotional experience into something that feels, you know, more resolved, as we kind of talked about with the stages of grief. Did that answer your question? I feel like I kind of went all over the place with that.
No, I think it was very useful, and you touch on a lot on the support system and the family and the parents and the coaches, etc. And it's actually a good segue because you both are specialized in dealing with relationship, and I wanted to hear from you, either one of you, or we can start with Sammy, I guess. But you know, in terms of athletic retirement, what could be the impact that you see on relationship with others, whether it's in the circle of family or teammates? What challenges, I guess, can athletes face?
When it comes to retirement of anything, whether it's a sport or another career, it's a change, and it adds stress, and it creates this need for us to readjust as a couple, as a family. If there are financial implications, then the relationship, the family, everything is going to change in respect to a retirement. I think when it comes to athletes, it's almost like there's something intangible about retiring from a sport. It's, for whatever reason, maybe, you know, I know that any person can be passionate about their career. And in fact, I believe myself to be a person who's very passionate about my career. But when sports are involved, it's like a second layer. It's like a love for this thing that your partner and certainly your children are probably not going to fully understand. So I think that the more that we work on processing our grief related to retiring from sport, the more languaging we give ourselves to then relay that to our spouse or our family members, our parents who maybe are worried about us. But until we do that work, there's kind of this big question mark around what am I even feeling, first off. Mm-hmm. But then to be able to give my people, my closest people, something that they can understand as to why I think maybe I'm having a hard time or what I'm feeling on the inside. I think that's where you run the risk of even distance being placed between spouses, that when there's this unknown and it's something that you don't want to talk about because you're emotionally involved in it, your partner is going to have they're going to be perhaps the first one to see. Your spouse is often the first person to recognize something's going on. And then if you don't ever bridge that gap to open up good communication, it may be something that creates distance, that your partner is just lost. Like, I don't really know what to do. This is not the same person that I married. I don't know who this is. So I think there's a lot to be risked when it comes to relationships and the pain that comes from retirement and the loss involved.
And can you give us, Erika, can you give us some advice on how to better deal with the challenges, as you know, the relationship challenges, but also perhaps as either parents or spouses, how to support someone who is going through such a strong transition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I love what Sammy said, and I totally agree that when as the athlete, like, you accepting responsibility for your own emotional experience. And it's so true. If you have more of an awareness of what's going on with you emotionally, then you can actually communicate that well, communication is another whole thing, but you have more tools in your own toolbox to be able to communicate what it is that you need to those people who care about you. And I think, what she said is so important. And oftentimes, there are experiences, I'm sure, where maybe athletes aren't wanting to like really take inventory and would get really clear on how it is that they're feeling. And so, the relationship, the people who are close to them will be kind of looking to try to support in other ways. So, I just think like in the event of, and again, this is drawing from what Sammy said with the spouse noticing like something's up with you or something's going on, just any person who's close to the athlete, just being able to kind of pose the question and listen open-endedly, like not you're being a jerk, or you're in another bad mood today or whatever, like, just trying to get curious, like, it seems like something's been going on with you, and I'm wondering if you are missing your sport, or, just kind of having some open-ended questions like, how are you feeling today? And just allowing for a conversation to begin. And sometimes also like, I think maybe a less intrusive or less vulnerable, I guess would be a better word than intrusive, but a less vulnerable way to kind of check in could be to talk about the sport, or to talk about the experience or the teammates or whatever, asking questions about that. And you'll get a lot of information if they're shutting you down and they don't want to talk about it as the athlete. I would invite anyone who's, the athlete to try to be as open and kind to yourself with your emotional experience, and kind of get clear on what it is that you are experiencing, putting names to the feelings. And then also the support, the support people, your spouses, your parents, your athlete specialists, your coaches, just kind of some patience and curiosity and questions, and like Sammy said, like it's a deep love, so you want to kind of treat it as such, and kind of, I know our culture in the US, I don't know that we have a great experience with knowing how to deal with loss. I think, it can be a very difficult kind of space to tread for anybody. If we've lost a spouse or a sister or a, mother or a grandmother or whatever, a lot of times people don't know how to deal with that. So just, I would say just kind of see if you can find some resources. If you are a support person, if you are, a parent or a spouse or, a coach, to find some resources to like get yourself feeling like you're equipped to ask the right questions, or to say, I can tell you're not feeling so well today. Do you want to talk about it? Just equipping yourself with information, I think, is another really good way to kind of make sure that you can open the door for any conversation that may arise. And then, even the athlete too, kind of seeking out support, whether that's looking on the internet for, how do other athletes experience this, or reaching out to somebody to have a discussion about how you're experiencing it. I think, all of that is important there. And, the other thing is that there's really no one size fits all for this process. So kind of giving yourself some leeway for whatever works for you, I think is another really important piece. And in an ideal world, everyone would have an understanding of this and know the right questions to ask and, the right things to say in response. But, we're all going to get it wrong sometimes. But just, just giving yourself some permission. If you
Yeah.
screw it up, then, try again later, something like that.
I think what's interesting about what you both said is that athletes suppress their emotions for so many years, and they might be experiencing all these emotions and feelings as they retire, and they have no idea what's going on with them and how to deal with it. And I really like what you mentioned, Erika, on the people around them, the support system, the spouses, the parents, can be the starting point to diffuse those or open the line of communication, because the athlete themselves might not be able to do that because they have never felt this way in their life. This is not something that they let themselves be able to feel in the past. And so having someone external that don't know them really well and is able to sort of be that first drop, or that first way of diffusing it, I think that's really important. And I also really like you're touching on the curiosity, or maybe looking back at your sport, maybe not everybody will have just positive feeling about their career, especially if the ending was honestly what they chose. But there are certainly moments that you can go back to in your sport that you really enjoy, and maybe starting with these as a as the starting point, which is comfortable, to get a conversation going. I really like those 2 points. I think those are really, really useful. Okay, so as we sort of get to the end of our conversations, you're, Erika, especially, you're a therapist, but you also eventually became a coach. And so I wanted to touch on this a little bit, in this big mindset switch that athletes have to go through from their career to the next part of their life. And part of it goes with what we've talked about throughout this whole webinar on, you not allowing yourself to feel certain things in order to achieve your best self in that field. And so I'm curious of that process, Erika, for you. Can you explain why you decided to add the coach side to your journey, I guess?
Mm-hmm.
Also for athletes to understand what the difference is between working with a therapist and a coach, and how can they both beneficial, obviously.
Yeah. So, one of the things that kind of leads right into that question. So throughout this whole process of grief that we've talked about, and kind of transitioning from sport or losing your sport, when you're getting more closure, when you're starting to feel like, okay, this chapter has been kind of, this is the, this was the end of this particular experience of this sport as I know it, and you move towards that acceptance in the stages that we kind of outlined earlier. There's something that can shift here where you start to begin to entertain a different vision for your life. Like, what would I love to focus all this attention and energy on that I've, directed towards my sport? Now, that can't happen right initially when it ends, and it shouldn't really, because then you're not dealing with the feelings. But so that kind of leads right into like my therapy into coach thing. I really love, like Sammy, I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I really loved the relationship focus of the clinical side of my work. But we also are licensed to treat the entire mental health spectrum of disorders. So what I found in my practice is that I was getting clients to a place where they felt better. And so like the crisis was over, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I always wanted, like, okay, so now the crisis is over. So let's like take your life to the next level where you can really like start to feel more expanded, and like you're living a life that really is meaningful to you. And just by the nature of therapy, and this isn't to say that all therapy is like this, but this was just my experience. I kept feeling like then we were done with therapy. And so like the taking it to the thriving wasn't really a part of therapy, in my experience. And not to say that it can't ever be in therapy, because I know that a lot of people do go from like just surviving to thriving in the therapy model. But I just started getting really curious about how to sustain positive, lasting change, and then really take things to the next level. Like not moving from crisis to crisis, but really like, how do I change the way I'm thinking about my life to really take myself to, a level of success, happiness, performance, that maybe I haven't experienced yet. So I got really curious about that. And I started looking into the coaching, because just it was kind of becoming more popular as I was getting curious about it. And I really loved the whole let's focus on thriving, not just moving through the challenges. And so, I want to, because I am still a licensed therapist, I have a lot of respect for therapy and therapists. And I think it's a really important component of dealing with mental health issues. So I think that, if there is something that you're feeling stuck in, so to speak, it can be a really important process to go through to work with a therapist and, shift your perspective around some things. And, therapy can be really good for that, potentially looking back at how you became the way you are and kind of what you would like to do differently going forward, I think is a really important piece. And so, that's kind of the therapy process from my experience in working with my clients. And then with coaching, I take my clients, not that every one of my coaching clients is, all right, I'm all happy, and I have no issues. That's not the case, but it's more, it is more focused on, okay, so here are some things that I would like to shift, and how can I, let's lay the groundwork for continuing to grow and thrive and feel really, really like I'm using all of my life energy to really live in a way that feels really meaningful to me, that feels like I'm operating in a way that I'm at the top of my game for life, not just sports. So the distinctions are kind of, they're not necessarily super cut and dried, but I wanted to really allow another piece in my work with clients for like, let's focus on the thriving in addition to the resolving of the challenges.
Absolutely. And I think, this is something for all of us in former athletes and athletes, we can all relate to, because as an athlete, you're a high performer, you're constantly trying to optimize your health, your performance, your person. And so, it makes a lot of sense. And I think we've just started touching on that mindset change, and the growth mindset that we try to teach to athletes that, to use after sport, not just in their sport. This is something that they really know how to use and do during their sporting career, and they need to be able to switch that over to their next stage in life, I guess. And I think often they are, and we're going to finish on this, and I think, Sammy, you're going to talk to us a little bit about limiting belief and fears. I think it really is important for athletes to learn about this, because they are high performance in silo, kind of. They sort of know exactly how to do this in one space, but sometimes they have struggle seeing it in the other space. And so can you tell us a little bit, Sammy, on what are limiting beliefs and fears, and how do these apply to athletes in transition, and how can they overcome that?
Sure. I think if we're all honest with ourselves, when we switch out of something that we know like the back of our hand, something that's It's muscle memory to a certain degree. It is the thing that we are undoubtedly more of an expert in than anything else. And then we start to tread the water of something new. I think there's often a great deal of fear there. And in fact, just to give a little bit of personal experience, it was really difficult for me to not be good at what I was trying to do in that moment. So when I switched from being an athlete into training to learn to help others in, the therapy modalities, of course, I shouldn't be an expert at that right away. But in my athlete mind, I just wasn't really used to not being the best, like not being super great. And so, I think I learned a lot through that, though. I learned to, like Erika talks about, just give myself space to not be perfect at something, and to really take time to slow down and acknowledge that I was starting something new, and that it would take time for me to excel at it in the same way that I had excelled in my sport. So, I think, yes, I guess recognizing first that the fear is there, and then preventing yourself from being too hard on yourself about what you're not doing. If you feel you're not doing well enough at it, rather than compare your ability to perform in your new career with your ability to perform in your age-old sport that you're so good at. I think that's the way to start to really acknowledge that the journey of learning something can there's beauty in that too, of not just being awesome at it right away.
Yeah, and recognizing that, throughout your whole sporting career, it took so many repetition and failures and time to actually get good at something. And it's that same process you need to transfer over. Ladies, is there anything else or that you want to highlight or talk to us about as we wrap up today?
Well, one thing you mentioned, limiting beliefs, Miriam, and I just want to, I love that Sammy was able to give her example of her experience, because I think the limiting beliefs, in my experience, I haven't met one person who doesn't have some sort of limiting belief. So, no one, if you're human, at least, I don't know, maybe I've never met them, but I think the majority of us have some sort of limiting belief that for whatever reason has been in our minds, let's say unconsciously programmed there, and it is like the internal critic or whatever. So really learning to cultivate an awareness of when you're hearing from that part of you, and just getting curious about how you respond to it, I think is a really big piece, because most of us can hear from that critic or whatever, and then that can deter us from doing something. Like in Sammy's case, she wasn't experienced, or she wasn't used to like having to kind of learn all of these things and not just be an expert at it right away. And but she had the awareness to notice that and be like, no, well, this is new and I'm going to keep going at this. And, so that can be applied to anything, like, if you're trying to learn how to dance, and you're not a dancer, just giving yourself permission to just acknowledge that, you're not going to be an expert at everything. And I think like the high performing athlete, I think the perfectionistic piece is another thing just to be aware of, because that perfectionistic voice can sometimes paralyze people from taking any other action, when it's just more about working with it and getting curious about the voice, and then cultivating a part of yourself that can notice that and continue to move forward in the face of it, I think is the trick. And this isn't a one-time thing. Like, this is, again, like you said, reps. So we're doing it all the time, and we're practicing and we're noticing, and we're practicing and we're noticing. we're taking another step. And so that's just one thing that I just wanted to point out, because the limiting beliefs, in my experience, are very, very common for everybody.
Yeah. And the more you practice it, you practice new things, or you get curious about something, the more you can recognize your own patterns and be able to learn from them and change your reaction to something later on. So absolutely, really, really interesting. So we've reached the end of our webinar for today, and I wanted to thank you for your contribution in sharing your knowledge today. It was really, really interesting, and I appreciate it very much. And wanted to share with everybody that we have a multitude of events available every week that you can join on Tuesday morning. If you want to learn more about our events, you can go to our website at athletesoul.space/events. We have a lot of things going on for the month of June, including on the topic of mindfulness for optimized performance and health. That will be really interesting. It's actually coming next week. And other than that, we will be sending you the information about these events from today, the recording, so you can get back to it and learn a bit more or share it with your athletes. So thanks everybody for joining. Thank you, Erika and Sammy, much appreciated. Thanks for the support that you have provided to Athlete Soul and continue to provide. And I wish you all a great day. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Miriam.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.